Greetings all, and welcome to part 3 of my Tamiya 1/72nd scale FW190 A3 build. In part 1 I covered building the aircraft, part 2 I covered painting, and in this third part I'll be experimenting with some different weathering techniques, including using oil paints for the first time, and trying some new techniques for chipping. So without further ado, let's finish off this kit. I cut out the smaller parts which I'd left on the sprue during painting of the main aircraft, which included the various parts of the landing gear, main wheels, the cooling fan, propeller and spinner, the headrest, cannon barrels, and the pitot tube. I glued the struts to the landing gear doors and used a sanding file to clean up the seam lines from these various parts, before then assembling the propeller, headrest, and gluing the pitot tube onto the wing. All of these finer parts were given a coat of Vallejo acrylic gloss black primer, which I probably could have done earlier while I primed the rest of the model before painting it, but oh well, those are notes for next time. After giving the primer 12 hours to fully cure, the main landing gear and tail wheel were then glued to the fuselage, along with the pilot's stepladder and the cannon barrels. Once the landing gear was in place and solid, I glued the main wheels to them, and then began painting the details. First I painted some Vallejo Model Air RLM 66 onto the headrest, followed by some Vallejo Model Air RLM 4 for the inner surface of the main landing gear, the struts, and the tail wheel. The tyres and main wheel hubs were then painted with Vallejo model colour flat black, while the propeller received several coats of AK Interactive acrylic RLM 70. The pitot tube and ladder were painted AK RLM 76 Variation 1 to match the camouflage on the underside of the aircraft, and I did a few more coats of these various colours until all the parts were nice and solid. The upper surface of the pitot tube was painted AK Interactive RLM 75 to match the camouflage colours, and once all the control tabs and stepladder markings had been painted with Vallejo Vermilion Red, the cover on the wheel struts had been painted model colour saddle brown, and the wheels had been neatened up. I gave the model another light coat of matte varnish to protect the paint on these additional parts from scratching, and moved on to weathering. I decided to experiment a fair bit with this kit, starting with creating some superficial scratches by mixing RLM 75 and 74 with a little bit of white, and then using a fine brush to dry brush and stipple it along areas I wanted to create some chipping. These included the walkway areas along the wing, around the access hatches for the engine, and on the leading edges of the wings. By using a mix of the camouflage colour and white, you can create some very subtle scratches that look like the paint has been slightly damaged, but it's a lot more subtle than if you'd used straight up aluminium, and a bit more realistic in my opinion. I definitely though could have used a bit less paint and made a more subtle effect, but after it dried I was really happy with how it turned out. I still used some Vallejo Model Air aluminium to dry brush some deeper metal chips, especially around the walkway, on the leading edges of the wings, the edges of the propeller blades, the leading edge of the engine cowling, and for some chipping on the underside of the wings, landing gear, and the access hatches. I gave the aluminium and the lighter chips a few hours to fully dry, and in the meantime I painted the cannon barrels and engine exhaust heat shield with Vallejo Model Air Gunmetal Metallic, and the wingtip navlights were given a base coat of Vallejo Model Air RLM 1 Silver. I also experimented for the first time using Abteilung oil paints for some weathering, which I'd originally picked up for some armoured projects but decided to try out on this aircraft. I used some engine grease for exhaust stains and some streaks, as well as buff for some dirt on the tyres, and I did plan to use some white for some discoloration, but in the end decided not to use it. I've heard it's best to let the oil drain a little bit from the paints for around about 2 hours, so I put them out on a piece of cardboard and set them aside, and in the meantime went over some of the larger metal chips I'd created using the aircraft's camouflage colours to reduce how much metal chipping there was, and also create a subtle faded effect and some sharper corners, making the paint wear look a little bit more toned down and realistic. Next I applied some Tamiya dark brown enamel panel wash to all of the recessed details on the aircraft to create some post shading, highlight all of the panel details, and add a subtle amount of grime. For a darker effect, I still used black panel accent, especially around the engine, exhaust, and landing gear areas where oil and fluids could potentially leak, and also along the edges of all the control surfaces to give them some added depth. Once the panel washes had dried, I then dipped a brush and a cotton bud in some X20 enamel thinners, and used them to rub away and blend the excess to create a more subtle effect. This was the first time I'd used predominantly dark brown to apply the main wash, and I really loved the effect on the lighter underside, but found with the darker upper surface camouflage colours it blended in a little bit too much. By now the oil paints had lost most of their glossy oil, so I mixed them with a tiny bit of AK odourless thinners, and used a brush to stipple the engine grease oil paint around the exhausts, some of the access hatches, and the shell ejector ports, before then streaking it backwards. The oil paints were really easy to blend and streak using the odourless thinners, and they produced a really nice matte faded finish, although I found the engine grime colour was a bit too brown for some areas, so I used some Tamiya XF1 flat black enamel paint in a very similar fashion, instead using X20 enamel thinners to blend it. The oil and the enamel paints didn't really blend together, and I think that the oils were much nicer to blend, but I was still pretty happy with the effects. In the future, I may get some blacker oil paints for experimenting with exhaust stains, and also for those heavier oil streaks often on radial engines. I then mixed up the buff oil with some odourless thinners, and applied it onto all of the wheels, the landing gear doors, and the base of the rudder to create a subtle dirt effect. I also experimented with adding a few dots of buff onto the wings, and then streaking it backwards for some variation and a bit of discoloration. The thinner was then used to remove the excess from the landing gear and the exhaust area, and once I'd added and blended some layers of the oil and the enamel flat black around the exhausts, I was pretty happy with the result. With the weathering done, I finally neatened up the front canopy framework by using a cocktail stick to carefully scratch away any excess acrylic paint, and then I removed the mask from the main canopy and the cockpit area. I really should have done this a lot sooner however, as the Tamiya tape came off pretty easy from the canopy, but either the Vallejo liquid mask or the blue tack left some very bad marks on the inside of the canopy. I tried using some blue tack and a damp cotton bud to remove the excess, and it did help, but there were still some ever so slightly visible marks. I decided in the end to bring out some Deluxe Materials Looks Like Glass, and using a brush, applied some onto both the inside and outside surface of the clear parts. This was then left for 24 hours to cure, and afterwards I found that it definitely made a big improvement to all of the clear parts. While the Looks Like Glass cured, however, I painted another coat of RLM66 on the headrest, and painted the glare shield with a few coats of flat black, and also dabbed some onto the ejector port and cannon barrels for some added effects for the gun smoke. I put the decal for the headrest in some water, and while I waited for it to come loose, I painted the cushion on the headrest with a little bit of flat black. The decal was then slid onto the headrest and given some Tamiya decal adhesive to help it stick down. Unfortunately though, I accidentally did this with the Eduard 190's headrest, which, as you will see, did not fit the Tamiya canopy. Yeah, be careful when you're working on two of the same or very similar types of aircraft at once, but from different kit brands. Anyways though, the glare shield was finished off by using chocolate brown for the trim, and then I dry brushed it with some Vallejo model colour light brown to give it a faded leathery look. Once the glare shield was dry, I carefully removed the sprue attachment points from the front canopy, and glued it into place using some Deluxe Materials Rocket Odorless CA glue. When I attempted to glue the headrest in place and it didn't fit, I realised my mistake. I quickly painted the Tamiya part, and then after re-gluing the front windshield to make it fit a bit more snugly, I then glued the headrest to the main canopy, and added the Eduard kit's warning decal to it, and gave it a dab of Tamiya decal adhesive. I find the Deluxe Material Odorless CA glue works really excellently for gluing clear parts, as it doesn't tend to fog up and still offers a good strong, albeit slightly brittle bond. The final touches to finish up the model were to paint the left navlight with Tamiya Clear Green, the right navlight with Tamiya Clear Red, and to add the early single antenna wire leading from the tail to the canopy using some AK Interactive Mega Thin rubber rigging wire. I had a bit of trouble getting it to stick to the canopy initially, and found that regular cheap CA glue worked a lot better than the odorless CA glue, but once I got it into place, I left it to dry for a few minutes, and then added a dob of the CA glue to the tail, fitted the canopy in place, and stretched the wire till it reached the tail and cut away the excess. I probably made the rigging wire a little bit too tight, but I managed to lengthen the wire slightly by stretching it very gently, and once this was done, the Tamiya Fw 190 A-3 was finally completed. And here you can see the finished model. So I'm really pleased with how this one turned out, especially with the airbrushing modelling, which I was attempting for the first time. It was a lot of fun to build and experiment with as well, and I really liked how the oil paints were to streak and fade, and the more subtle effects created by using white paint mixed with the base colour, rather than just straight up aluminium for the chipping. I also think that the looks like glass did a really great job improving the canopies. It's nice to have a great short-nosed early 190 variant available in 1/72nd scale, though I'm sure many people would like to see Tamiya introduce an equally good A8 tooling, or the overlooked A4, A5 and A6 variants. Apart from the decals being thick and even with the gloss coat still silvered a tiny bit, I would say this is a pretty fantastic kit. There are some really nice details, especially in the cockpit and wheel wells. I love the details for all of the access hatches and hinges around the engine area, and compared to the Airfix kit, I would say the Tamiya 190 is pretty much on par in terms of details, maybe with an upper hand, and it definitely beats the Airfix kit in terms of ease of assembly and quality of the molds, though obviously being different versions of the 190, if you want a later model A8 like the Airfix kit, then the Tamiya kit isn't really a better choice. For around 20 AUD, I think it's a really well priced kit, and it comes with 3 scheme choices, which, as long as you have some products to handle the decals with, are usable, and it's definitely a great kit for beginners to learn and build, and an easy, fun little mojo build kit for those more experienced to grab off the shelf and just shake and bake. Thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and the rest of my series on building the Tamiya 190 A3. If you did, please be sure to leave a like, and feel free to leave any friendly suggestions for how I can improve, and any questions you have in the comments. A massive thank you to my wonderful patrons who made my airbrushing booth possible. If you want to help fund my build and stop motion projects, please consider joining my Patreon, the link will be in the description. I will be releasing a full uncut version of this build if you want to watch all parts at once, which will also have some action images of the finished 190. All going well, I should have the first part of my Edgeward 190 A5 build coming out next week, along with another F4U Corsair inbox review. Thanks again for watching, and until the next video, take care, model on, and shake and bake.
Yeah.
What?
Shake and bake.